Joined here on Next by Democratic State Representative Matthew Gray Broomfield. Thank you for coming in.
Absolutely, glad to be here.
So, Coloradans not historically enthusiastic about tax increases for pretty much any reason. Do you think there would be support there for a tax increase to build out rail on the Front Range?
I think it's possible, especially because I think people, as we have grown more and more, are looking for ways to relieve congestion and will be open to new ideas. I think the key will be a credible idea where people could know what to expect and can get they believe that the results will actually make their lives better, make their commute better, make their business travel better, and actually feel like there's real credibility behind it. But I do think, again, it's not going to be an easy road, but I think it's worth taking a look at because the growth is not going anywhere and we're going to need solutions to address it.
It's interesting that you bring up the word credibility because I think people look to transit promises of the past and say, did they deliver on my tax money? So this is a great time to mention the train to Longmont, which this is an updated calculation today that I did. The 2050 train start would be 11,035 days from now. You represent folks up there in that neck of the woods. What do you think needs to be demanded of the people who are promising rail so we don't end up in a situation like that?
I think that very much so that particular failure and in general the challenges we face with fast tracks would have to be addressed as part of additional revenue to pay for rail. As you know, I represent Broomfield and Boulder County, sitting right on that line. The train to Longmont goes right through my district. And those folks still ask questions about it every day. They've been paying sales taxes for it for over a decade now, and they haven't seen it. And so I think the big questions are both, how do we know that the Front Range Rail itself would be able to deliver on the promises that were made, but also, what's the status of the promises that we've already made? We already have unpaid debts that we have right now to taxpayers. How are we going to make them whole as we look at an overall strategy for rail across the state? I think that expanding rail is really exciting, but we can't look at it with blinders on. We have to look at it with context for history and with respect to folks who've been made promises that haven't been kept.
Why not say, listen, that's sad, you guys were promised a train, you paid a lot of money, you're not going to get it, but let's build what makes the most sense now, as opposed to saying, well, we've got to build every train that we ever promised before we build this new one. Why not separate the two?
I think the way to look at it, I don't think that you necessarily have to say the exact thing that was on paper in 2004 must be delivered before anything else can be done. I don't think you have to say it that way. I do think you can't look at the whole situation, though, without taking a look at the equity. And if Front Range Rail is going to go directly north-south and get nowhere near Boulder, Broomfield, Longmont, and we're going to say, look, promises were made to a lot of people, they're going to be kept to everybody but except you, then I think we have to answer the question, how do we provide equity for those people? They're paying in the exact same way, they live here the exact same way. I don't think it's fair to say, look, you're just the odd person out, especially if they're going to be taxed for this additional Front Range Rail too. So you're already paying for one train that isn't going to service your area. We're going to ask you to come pay for another one, and we have no plan to tell you about how we're going to make you whole for that. I just don't think that's equitable. I think that you always have to be flexible. Transit and transportation are changing all the time. So you always have to be flexible about what the plan is, but the plan has to be equitable regardless of what the structure is.
I mean, I'm sure you would acknowledge that if every elected representative says, the thing comes to my town or it doesn't happen, well, then it's never going to happen. But you think that you guys are in a special circumstance because of the broken promises to your community.
Yeah, I mean, right now, where our passenger rail stops, the whole entire North Metro area is the part that has been left out. And again, it would be one thing if everybody who was south of, the G line as it exists right now had voted yes and we weren't paying any taxes for it. That'd be one thing. But right now we're paying in at just the same rate and we're shown a map of a regional plan. And so I absolutely agree. Like it's definitely going to be, especially when it comes to a train, like you can't have a train on every city block in the state. Like that doesn't work. But when the plans develop and an entire region was left out of something, they were shown a big beautiful map and their part was taken off of it. I do think it's a fair question to ask, to say before you're coming to them and saying, look, invest even more in rail, to talk about how much are you really going to ask me to invest in rail before I actually see some rail somewhere close to my community, even if it's not down my city block, somewhere close to my community and my neighborhood.
Do you think there's an issue that's going to come up that you guys are going to have to fight through in terms of public perception of big ticket projects like this? You hear about the Hyperloop, you hear about those kind of things, and people kind of have this idea that, well, it's not going to happen. It's too big.
I mean, this comes on top of a backdrop where we're presently about $9 billion underfunded in existing transportation projects in the state before we ever get to an additional rail line. So then, yes, right now we have a systemic underfunding of the transportation just to keep the roads maintained that we have right now and to do the projects that are already on the books that we know we're going to need to do to accommodate our growth. So yes, I also think that this conversation can't be had in a vacuum separately from our overall transportation funding conversation that we're having in the state every day, and we need to keep having, again, with voters, with each other at the legislature, because I don't think a project that's this ambitious will ever be able to happen against a vacuum and an underfunding of transportation and everywhere else. We do need, as a state, to recognize what our transportation funding needs are, and we need to meet those needs. If this is a part of it, I think that'd be exciting, and I think it'd be great, but I think there's nowhere to have one conversation without having the other.
Can they happen simultaneously, or do you think Colorado needs to not finish the conversation about existing transportation funding issues, but at least deal with what I feel like we've been on the cusp of for a couple legislative sessions now before we get to rail?
I think we definitely can have the conversation at the same time, and I think we have to. I don't think it's not responsible to our citizens to not be having these conversations as quickly and as seriously as we can, because we're behind. You know, everybody understands that the growth is occurring. Not everybody understands just how fully we're underinvesting. But transportation is expensive and it takes a long time. So if we reached a solution right now, like let's say we had, you wrote me a check for $11 billion right now and we did the whole thing, it still wouldn't be built for a great number of years, and people are moving here every day. So we don't have the luxury. I wish we had the luxury of taking everything sort of one step at a time, but we need to take all of our infrastructure challenges seriously because we're behind the 8 ball right now. We're not where we should be.
So imagine this rail line from Fort Collins to Pueblo. The CDOT should run that?
Perhaps. I'm not wed to any particular management structure. I mean, if there's a plan and there's responsibility and accountability for it, I'm not particularly wed to one particular agency or another being in charge of it.
What do you think about the general idea of CDOT kind of getting into the business of actually moving people as opposed to just building the infrastructure? You've got the Mustang service, and there might be rail and so forth.
I'm perfectly fine with it. I think it's good. Again, I think that as we approach infrastructure, we're dealing with underfunding, but we're also dealing with a future where it's very hard for us to know exactly what transportation is going to look like 20 years from now, 40 years from now, 60 years from now. You know, when we know that electric vehicle majority is coming, we don't know exactly when. We know autonomous vehicles are coming, we don't know exactly when. And we know that, frankly, there's some corridors where there's just not that much room to add more traffic lanes. You know, we did a tour with the Transportation Committee across I-70 before. There's just not that many places where we don't even have the physical space to add a bunch of lanes onto I-70. There's only so many options for moving more people there. So I think that nobody should be rigid about this is the one delivery method, this is the one way to do it. I think we need to be open to all modes of transportation and all delivery actors, knowing that no matter whom is in charge, whomever is going to be trusted with this money, they have transparency and accountability about how it occurs.
Last question. It will obviously take money to do this. Money comes from people. Do you get the sense that Coloradans' attitudes in general toward taxation, how it's structured in this state, are changing?
I don't know if they're changing, but I do think, especially in the area of transportation, they're willing to have the conversation. I think that when you combine people's commute times as they are right now, but also with housing affordability right now, and how hard it is to get from a place where you can afford a home to a place where your job is, where more and more places where folks cluster to work are becoming completely unaffordable. The people I talk to want to have a conversation about transportation, and they know the transportation isn't free. The core key of that is transparency and accountability, and that people know what they're paying into. I think people do want to pay for more mobility. I think they do see the threat that underfunding transportation is to the state, but they want there to be accountability for it. They want to be able to understand it. They don't want to spend a bunch of money that's not actually going to make their lives any better.
Representative Matt Gray of Broomfield, appreciate you coming in, and look forward to our next conversation. I hope that it is fewer than 11,035 days from now.
I hope so as well.
Subscribe to the next YouTube channel and I'll buy you a beer. Am I actually buying them a beer? This could be a very poor idea. We need some terms and conditions. Offer subject to terms and conditions.